Picture this. A caravan stretches across the horizon. Thousands of camels in single file, their shadows flickering against the burning sand. Each step is deliberate, unbroken, the rhythm of centuries. On their backs, they carry more than goods. Slabs of salt cut from desert mines, sacks of gold dust sifted from riverbeds, manuscripts inked in fine Arabic script, and sometimes human beings bound in chains. But what if I told you this wasn't just transport? It was power in motion, a kingdom on the move. This was no ordinary caravan. It was an artery of history, pulsing across the Sahara, carrying lifeblood between distant worlds. And at its center stood a people without walls, yet rulers of roots. They were the Tuareg, nomads of the desert, veiled in indigo, who turned emptiness into empire. How can a people with no palaces still shape the fate of continents? We often imagine kingdoms as stone walls and golden thrones, the markets of Timbuktu, the palaces of Mali, the ruins of great Zimbabwe. But the Sahara tells another story. Its kingdom was invisible, hidden in sand, yet powerful enough to shape the destiny of empires. A kingdom you can't see, but one you can't ignore. How do you rule a kingdom made not of bricks and mortar, but of movement and memory? To answer that, we must first understand the stage, the Sahara itself. The Sahara is the largest hot desert in the world, stretching some 9 million square kilometers, bigger than the entire United States. To outsiders, it looked like a natural wall, a lifeless expanse dividing North Africa from the lands beyond the Niger River. European maps once marked it with blank spaces, as if nothing could survive there. But here's the twist. The desert was never empty. To those who lived within it, the Sahara was an ocean of sand, where dunes rolled like waves, winds blew like tides, and stars guided travelers like lighthouses. And like every ocean, it had its ports, oases like Ghadames, Timbuktu, Agadez, Ghat. To those who knew its secrets, the desert was not a void, but a highway, alive with trade, knowledge, and power. What others feared as a barrier, the Tuareg embraced as a bridge. Crossing this ocean required more than strength. It required mastery. And the masters were the Tuareg. But how did they tame what seemed untamable? The Tuareg are a Berber-speaking people, part of the broader Amazigh family whose roots run deep into North Africa. They call themselves Kel Tamashek, those who speak Tamashek. Their homeland spans the central Sahara, today's Mali, Niger, Algeria, Libya, Burkina Faso. To most, these are lines on a map. But to the Tuareg, land was not fixed borders. It was roots, wells, grazing grounds, and memory. For them, the desert wasn't emptiness, it was identity. Camels were the vessels of this hidden kingdom, and the Tuareg were their captains. The camel's ability to drink once and then walk days without water turned the impossible into routine. Their padded feet floated over dunes that swallowed oxen and horses. A single beast could carry hundreds of pounds. Multiplied by thousands, they became moving cities. Caravans could stretch for miles, a spectacle of wealth and endurance. But camels alone weren't enough. The real treasure was knowledge. Hidden beneath dunes lay wells known only to a few. The stars marked pathways across the endless expanse. Even the faintest track of hooves in the sand could reveal the way forward. Maps drawn on paper meant nothing here. The Tuareg carried maps in memory, passed from elders to youth in song and story. Lose the map of memory, and the desert swallows you whole. As one Tuareg elder explained to a French ethnographer, "We do not own the desert owns us." but we know its secrets. And that is our power. That power transformed them into the indispensable navigators of trans-Saharan trade. For centuries, they guided caravans laden with gold from the Niger Valley, salt from Tagaza and Taoudenni, textiles from Morocco, manuscripts from Cairo, and enslaved people forced into markets from Tripoli to Tunis. Imagine it. Wealth, knowledge, and even human lives, all flowing on paths only they could command. At the mines of Taoudenni, enslaved laborers cut 70-kilogram slabs of salt from the earth. A caravan of 10,000 camels might carry these south, where salt was as valuable as gold. In return, gold dust flowed north, enriching Mediterranean and even European markets. Salt and gold, one dug from the earth, the other sifted from rivers, both worth their weight in survival. But the Tuareg did more than guide. They controlled. They taxed caravans, negotiated passage, and when it suited them, raided travelers foolish enough to attempt the desert without their blessing. To make the desert safe or unsafe was their true power. And in this control, they forged something rare, a kingdom not of walls, but of pathways. It was power you couldn't see, but everyone crossing the Sahara felt it. Unlike the empires they served, Mali, Songhai, Ghana, the Tuareg had no single throne. Authority lay in confederations, the Kel Ahagar of southern Algeria, the Kel Ifogas of Mali, the Kel Ajer of Libya. Each ruled shifting zones defined not by fortresses, but by oases and routes. Their strength was mobility itself. Where others built capitals, the Tuareg built horizons. For outsiders, this made them both enigmatic and formidable. Armies could conquer cities. They could not conquer wind. To chase the Tuareg into the desert was to invite death, unless one had guides. And those guides were Tuareg themselves. In the Sahara, the hunter without a guide becomes the hunted. This was the hidden kingdom of the Sahara, a power invisible on maps, but undeniable in history. A kingdom whose currency was knowledge, whose castles were tents, and whose crowns were veils of indigo cloth. Before these caravans could march, entire communities bent themselves to the work of departure. In the courtyards of oases, women pressed dates, goat cheese, and millet into dense cakes called bulla, portable bricks of energy that might be the only food for weeks. Men checked the goatskin water skins, sealing their seams with resin. Even a single leak could doom an animal and its rider. Every preparation was a gamble between life and death. Every camel required its own rigging. 12 separate straps, braided from desert grass and leather. Too few, and the salt blocks might tumble into the sand, unrecoverable in a storm. One broken strap, one lost load, and weeks of work vanished into the dunes. Preparation wasn't only practical, it was ceremonial. On the eve of departure, the air pulsed with the deep rhythm of the tendé drum, struck by women as riders gathered. Their voices carried the sakuri, an ululating cry of blessing and farewell. Indigo turbans were wound tighter than usual, the dye staining cheeks and palms until men looked half-sculpted from the desert sky itself. In the flicker of firelight, the caravan was transformed from a logistical operation into something closer to ritual, a march that was both survival and memory. It wasn't just a journey, it was a rite of passage written in footsteps. Their society was hierarchical, yet deeply collective. Nobles carried military and political authority. Below them were vassals who herded livestock, religious scholars who preserved Islamic learning, artisans who crafted tools and jewelry, and enslaved people who performed much of the hardest labor. Yet within this layered system, a shared language, shared traditions, and shared symbols bound the Tuareg together as one people. But what happens when hierarchy itself must be packed on a camel's back? Perhaps the most iconic symbol was the veil. Unlike much of the Muslim world, where women veiled, among the Tuareg, it was men who covered their faces. The indigo-dyed tagelmust concealed everything but the eyes, a mark of maturity, respect, and identity. The dye often rubbed onto the skin, leaving men with a bluish tint, leading outsiders to call them the blue men of the desert. To be unveiled in public was dishonor. The veil was not just cloth, it was the fabric of status. And behind the veil lay not just a face, but an identity. If the veil symbolized male adulthood, women embodied cultural authority. Tuareg society was matrilineal. Property and descent often passed through the mother's line. Tents, herds, and even political legitimacy were traced back to women. They composed poetry, owned land, and could divorce husbands without losing standing. In contrast to patriarchal norms elsewhere, Tuareg women were keepers of continuity. As one proverb put it, "The tent is carried by the camel, but the family is carried by the woman." So while men shielded their faces, women carried the future. Language, too, was a cultural shield. The Tuareg spoke Tamashek, one of the Amazigh languages. But beyond spoken words, they preserved a unique script, Tifinagh. With roots stretching back 2 millennia, Tifinagh inscriptions dot rocks across the desert, carved long before colonial borders. Often it was women who used Tifinagh most, etching prayers, names, and symbols into stone, ensuring that memory could survive even when sand buried cities. Each carving was a refusal to disappear, a sentence against forgetting. Daily life was marked by movement. Families shifted with the seasons, seeking pastures for goats, camels, and cattle. Camps of leather tents rose at night, vanished by morning, leaving barely a trace. Children grew up not tied to fields or towns, but to horizons, learning to read stars like other children read books. Meals were simple: millet, dates, milk from camels or goats. Yet music and poetry filled evenings. For what is survival without song? The most haunting sound was the imzad, a single-stringed violin played only by women. Its bow drew out notes that seemed to echo the desert itself, lonely, yearning, eternal. Warriors listened to the imzad before battle. Lovers exchanged verses accompanied by its song. One old saying captures it well: "The imzad is the memory of our people. Its silence is death. Its song is life." When words failed, the imzad spoke. In every caravan, one figure carried authority above all others: the madugu, the guide. He was not always the leader in politics or birth, but once the caravan moved, his word was law. The madugu read the desert like a manuscript. Dune ridges, star patterns, even the tilt of a camel's ears became sentences only he could translate. When the desert itself became text, the madugu was the only one who could read it. The rhythm of travel was relentless. 14 hours on foot, day after day. 40 to 50 kilometers covered in silence, broken only by the bell of a led camel. The madugu walked at the front, rarely riding, for the caravan's line depended on his steps. Behind him stretched a city in motion, beasts loaded with salt, bula rations tucked in packs, and riders wrapped in indigo veils, each one trusting that the desert's secrets had been passed faithfully from father to son, from grandfather to grandson. one mistake could turn trust into tragedy. No desert journey was complete without trial. Sandstorms could rise without warning, turning noon into night. When the sky unthreaded and the air itself became knives of grit, there was no time to stop. Cloth was pulled tight across mouths, eyes fixed on the shoulder of the camel ahead. In such storms, the caravan followed not the stars, but the memory of rhythm, step after step, keeping line, waiting for the storm's fury to exhaust itself. The only compass was endurance. The madugu never stopped walking. His silhouette at the front was the only anchor in the chaos, a living compass. To lose sight of him was to vanish into the dunes forever. In those moments, one man's footsteps meant the difference between life and erasure. Water was the true law of the desert. Wells were guarded like fortresses, but their rules were older and stricter than any city's law. Each clan had wells of its own, and strangers might be asked to pay for the labor of raising water. But one rule was absolute. Water could not be denied to the thirsty. To turn someone away was a crime against both man and God, punishable by death. In the Sahara, survival itself was sacred. At large wells, a keeper dictated the order of drinking. First came camels, noble and most valuable, then cattle, then sheep and goats. Donkeys, beasts of burden, came last. Arguments were common, too many liters taken, too long at the trough, but the order itself was never broken. It was a hierarchy carved as deeply into desert life as the dunes themselves. Here, even thirst obeyed tradition. The men who dug the wells held their own prestige. Narrow shafts cut 30 or 40 meters into the ground with little more than rope, shovel, and nerve. They descended into darkness, where one misstep or loose stone could mean burial alive. Entire families owed survival to their skill, yet many never returned from their work. Every drop of water carried a shadow, the memory of the digger who paid for it. Even the camels seemed to sense water beneath the sand. Herds would sniff and paw at patches where the diggers would then begin their work. Wells might flood in rainy seasons or collapse in storms, but they remained the hidden lifelines of the Sahara. Monuments not built upward into the sky, but downward into the earth. Invisible, fragile, yet more powerful than any fortress. The Tuareg were central players in African history, shaping and being shaped by the great empires that bordered their world. And here the story expands, from tents and wells to thrones and armies. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mali Empire rose to power under rulers like Mansa Musa, whose legendary pilgrimage to Mecca carried caravans of gold. Timbuktu, perched on the desert's edge, became a city of scholars, traders, and scribes. Yet oral traditions suggest that long before it became Mali's jewel, it was Tuareg who first settled the site. Later, when Mansa Musa expanded, they were pushed aside, only to return decades later. So even Africa's most famous city of learning began with the footprints of desert nomads. In 1433, Tuareg forces captured Timbuktu itself, holding it for much of the 15th century. For the desert nomads, this city of mud brick mosques and libraries became a temporary capital. But Tuareg rule was never about walls. It was about controlling the arteries of salt and gold that flowed through. When the Songhai Empire later eclipsed Mali, the Tuareg adapted again, striking deals, taxing routes, or raiding when necessary. Empires rose on rivers, but their lifeblood ran through the sand. This flexibility was their genius. While empires demanded obedience, the Tuareg demanded mobility. they never sought to replicate the bureaucratic capitals of the South. Instead, their authority was like the dunes themselves, shifting, fluid, but enduring. Try to pin them down, and they slipped away like sand through fingers. Yet the desert was not invulnerable. In 1591, a Moroccan invasion shattered Songhai's dominance. Armed with arquebuses, Moroccan soldiers marched into Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné. Their rule was fragile, stretched thin by distance, but the Tuareg, ever mobile, resisted and retreated, waiting for opportunities to strike. For outsiders, the Sahara was a graveyard of ambitions. For the Tuareg, it remained a homeland. And in that graveyard, the Tuareg learned the art of outlasting everyone. Still, even the most adaptable people cannot remain untouched forever. The 19th century brought new intruders, European colonial powers. To them, the Sahara was not only an obstacle but a prize, a bridge between their North African possessions and their West African colonies. But what happens when a people defined by movement face conquerors obsessed with borders? French explorers entered Tuareg territory in the mid-1800s. Some never returned. Stories spread of entire caravans swallowed by sand, of ambushes that erased expeditions without trace. To European imaginations, the Tuareg became both demons and heroes, ferocious raiders and noble warriors veiled in blue. They embodied the desert's mystery and its danger. And when myth meets ambition, conflict is never far behind. But myth alone could not stop empire. By the late 19th century, France was determined to stitch Algeria and West Africa into a single colonial domain. Tuareg confederations, Kel Ahagar, Kel Ifogas, Kel Ajer, stood in the way. Clashes were inevitable. The question was no longer if they would fight, but how long they could endure. The Tuareg fought with the tactics of the desert: lightning raids, sudden ambushes, vanishing retreats. French officers described them as ghosts in indigo. Yet rifles, artillery, and reinforcements eventually tilted the balance. Still, every ghost left its scar. Their defiance reached its peak in 1916 during the First World War. With France stretched thin, a Tuareg leader named Ag Mohamed Wao Teguida Kaocen launched a revolt in Niger. His fighters besieged Agadez, ambushed convoys, and threatened to drive the French out altogether. For months, the desert seemed poised to reclaim itself. Imagine it: colonial officers trapped, convoys cut, and freedom rising on the horizon. But colonial empires had resources the Tuareg could not match. Machine guns broke camel charges, villages were burned, families executed, whole communities scattered. By 1917, the Kaocen Revolt was crushed, its dream of autonomy drowned in blood. It was the last great attempt to restore a fully independent desert kingdom. The rebellion ended, but the memory never died. Even in defeat, however, the Tuareg spirit endured. The desert had taught them the art of patience. Empires rose and fell. The dunes remained. And in silence, patience becomes power. The colonial conquest left wounds deeper than any raid or rivalry with Mali or Songhai. The French and Italians carved Tuareg lands into neat colonial borders that ignored the old caravan routes. What had once been a continuous desert world became fractured into bureaucratic pieces. Niger, Mali, Algeria, Libya, Burkina Faso. A people whose power had been movement now needed papers to cross the same sands their ancestors had roamed freely. The stars still pointed the way, but now the law said you couldn't follow them. Trade itself shifted. The camel, backbone of the Sahara's economy, was dethroned by trucks and railways. Colonial ports rerouted the flow of salt, gold, and goods. The caravans dwindled, their centuries-long role as lifelines of the desert reduced to a cultural echo. The Tuareg, who once taxed and controlled commerce between continents, found themselves marginalized, their hidden kingdom fractured not by war, but by maps and machines. And so the empire of movement was undone by the empire of wheels. Independence in the mid-20th century brought celebration to much of Africa. New flags, new anthems, new promises. But for the Tuareg, it often felt like old neglect under new rulers. The capitals of Niger and Mali sat far to the south, in fertile river valleys, treating the desert as a periphery. Investment flowed elsewhere. Political power clustered in cities the Tuareg rarely visited. The desert, once the center of trade and culture, became invisible in the eyes of these new states. Freedom had arrived, but it stopped at the river's edge. Rebellions were inevitable. In 1963, just 3 years after Mali's independence, Tuareg fighters rose in the Adrar Desifogus Mountains. They demanded autonomy, respect, and recognition. The government's response was brutal. Villages burned, civilians killed, rebels hunted. The rebellion was crushed, but bitterness simmered. The ashes of one revolt became the sparks of the next. Decades later, droughts devastated herds and livelihoods, driving many young Tuareg into rebellion once more. In the 1990s, uprisings erupted in Mali and Niger. Peace accords promised integration, development, and recognition. But promises came slow, if at all. For many, the memory of betrayal lingered longer than the ink of any treaty. In the desert, broken promises last longer than stone. Then came 2012. Fighters trained in Gaddafi's Libya returned home with weapons and experience. The national movement for the liberation of Azawad surged across northern Mali, capturing Gao, Kidal, and even Timbuktu. For the first time in centuries, Tuareg rebels declared independence, Azawad, their own state, their desert reborn. For one electrifying moment, the hidden kingdom rose again. But freedom was fleeting. Islamist groups, far better organized and funded, hijacked the rebellion. They imposed harsh rule, sidelined Tuareg leaders, and drew international intervention. French forces returned, and the dream of Azawad collapsed almost as soon as it began. For many Tuareg, it was both triumph and tragedy. Proof they could rise again, and proof of how fragile such rises could be. Hope turned to heartbreak in the span of months. Through it all, culture remained the most enduring shield. Even as politics faltered, Tuareg traditions thrived. Music became a weapon of survival. In exile camps, guitars hummed with desert blues, assouf. Bands like Tinariwen and Bombino blended ancient rhythms with modern instruments, carrying songs of exile, rebellion, and longing to stages in Paris, London, New York. Their lyrics spoke of lost roots, broken promises, but also of resilience. The desert was in their chords, and when the world listened, the Tuareg voice carried farther than any caravan ever had. Poetry remained the heartbeat of the people. Warriors composed verses before raids. Women recited laments under the stars. Lovers whispered stanzas into the night. Improvised, ephemeral, yet unforgettable, these words carried honor, grief, and pride through generations. Women were the guardians of continuity, teaching Tamashek, preserving Tifinagh, anchoring families even when men left for war or exile. In their tents, culture was defended more fiercely than in any battle. the sword may break, but the poem endures. The economy of survival still revolved around barter in oases like Bilma. Caravans arrived after weeks in the Tenere, their camels groaning under the weight of mats, dates, and grain. There, under the curious eyes of locals, the loads were unpacked. Food was measured not by scales, but by handfuls. Dates, citrus, millet exchanged for fragile slabs of salt. Mats bound the slabs tight, for a broken cake fetched only half its worth. In this economy, wealth was tactile, measured by fistfuls, not coins. Every fistful of grain was a reminder. Wealth in the desert was always fragile. Blacksmiths kept the flame alive. Their forges glowed in desert nights as they hammered takuba swords, daggers, and jewelry. The takuba, with its double-edged blade and decorated hilt, was more than a weapon. It was a lineage. To carry one was to carry history. Just as wells anchored survival, the smith's fire anchored memory, keeping the Tuareg tied to traditions even as the modern world shifted around them. Steel and fire, the desert's unbroken heartbeat. The caravans themselves, though fewer, still embody the rhythm of endurance. Camels, especially the light-coated Amazigh breed, walk nose to tail, stitching lines across the horizon. 1,000 beasts in single file, led by a madugu, whose knowledge of stars and dunes is worth more than gold. To return from such a journey with every camel alive and every load intact is victory enough. The desert, like time, tests all things. Every safe return is less conquest, more miracle. Today, the Tuareg stand at a paradox. Abroad, their music fills concert halls, their indigo veils symbolize resilience, their script inspires Amazigh revival. At home, many communities remain politically marginalized, caught between governments that mistrust them and conflicts they did not start. Climate change tightens its grip, shrinking pastures and deepening poverty. The desert blues sing of exile, but the exile is often within their own homeland. To the world, they are icons. At home, they are outsiders. And yet, endurance is the thread that ties past to present. The Tuareg remind us that kingdoms need not be defined by stone walls or golden thrones. Their power lay in knowledge of roots, mastery of trade, resilience in landscapes that defeated empires. Their kingdom was not a palace, but 1,000 oases. Not permanence, but movement. And in movement, freedom survives. As the 21st century unfolds, caravans still march. Fewer, slower, but alive. Their silhouettes cut against the horizon, carrying salt, stories, and survival. To watch them is to glimpse a history not erased by conquest or collapse. Every step forward is defiance. Picture it. Camels stitched in a line, each step deliberate, shadows flickering across sand. They carry more than salt and grain. They carry memory. They carry the lesson that freedom is not always about borders or capitals, but about movement, about knowing when to bend without breaking, when to endure rather than vanish. Their steps are lessons, written one footprint at a time. Empires rose and fell, Mali, Songhai, Morocco, France, but the Tuareg remained. Their kingdom was hidden not because it was weak, but because it was different. It was written not in stone, but in sand, not in walls, but in stars. And sometimes, the strongest kingdoms are the ones that leave no ruins. And as the desert sun sets over another caravan, we are left with their greatest gift. The reminder that survival is not just persistence, but dignity. True freedom, as the Tuareg have always known, is not the right to stay still, but the wisdom to keep moving. And in that wisdom, the hidden kingdom still breathes.